When a Montana rancher bought 160 acres for just $300, everyone thought he was insane. But when his horse began digging near a chained stone building, the truth that had been buried for 43 years finally came to light. Stay till the end to see how one horse uncovered a secret that changed everything. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The wind carried the smell of sagebrush across the wide Montana plains as Gary Noss squinted through the windshield of his pickup. It was early spring of 1987, and the dirt road stretched before him like a cracked vein through the golden grass. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills, lay the property that had been haunting his thoughts since the day he got the call. 160 acres for $300. It sounded like a joke or a trap, but curiosity had gotten the better of him. Gary wasn't a dreamer. He was a rancher, born and raised to believe in work, not luck. For 30 years he'd worked horses, breaking, breeding, training them. He knew good land when he saw it, and good deals even better. His current ranch, 40 miles south of Great Falls, had grown tight. 23 horses, a growing breeding program, and plans for a rescue operation that needed open range. Space. That's what this land promised. He spotted the agent's car up ahead, a tan Buick parked off the road near a leaning gate. The woman inside, Claire Webb, didn't even step out when he pulled up. She just rolled down her window halfway, as if the air itself was poisoned. "Mr. Noss," she said, forcing a smile. "Glad you could make it." Gary looked past her at the property. The Barnett Homestead, according to the deed. The place looked abandoned, but not ruined. A 2-story farmhouse, paint stripped by decades of wind, a red barn standing proud beside it, and, off to the left, a small stone building with a heavy wooden door, chained shut with 3 rusted padlocks. "This all of it?" Gary asked. 160 acres, she said quickly. "Main house, barn, well, outbuildings. The family's very motivated to sell." Gary raised an eyebrow. "Motivated as in desperate?" Claire hesitated. "Let's just say they want it gone. They're willing to transfer ownership today." Gary laughed. "For $300? You're kidding." "I wish I was," she said softly. "They want no contact, no questions, just your signature." He studied her. She looked nervous, eyes darting toward the stone structure as if afraid to even glance at it too long. "What's in there?" he asked, pointing. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know. The heirs wouldn't say. They told me not to open it." "Not that I would." "Look, Mr. Noss, if you want this place, it's yours. If not, I have to drive back to Great Falls before dark." Gary looked out across the land. It was good country. Rich grass, rolling hills, a seasonal creek glinting like silver at the eastern edge. Sure, the fence was half fallen and the paint was gone, but the bones were strong. This wasn't cursed. This was forgotten. He could hear his father's voice in his head. "Son, the only ghosts on land are the ones you bring with you." He signed the papers that evening in Claire's office. The seller's lawyer, a pale man named Donovan, barely looked him in the eye. The transaction took less than 15 minutes. No inspections, no conditions, no disclosures, just a single warning. "The family requests that you don't attempt to contact them," Donovan said, "and that you don't disturb anything that's been sealed." Gary chuckled, shaking his head. "You folks are superstitious, huh?" Donovan didn't smile. "We prefer cautious." When Gary left that office, deed in hand, he couldn't help but feel a thrill of victory. A practical man doesn't believe in curses, only opportunities. 3 days later, he returned with his trailer and his most trusted partner, Harley, his 10-year-old quarter horse. Harley was calm, steady, fearless. Nothing ever rattled him, but when the trailer rolled past the sagging gate of the Barnett homestead, Harley's ears shot back and his entire body tensed. Gary unloaded him and patted his neck. "Easy, boy. It's just land." But the horse didn't believe him. Harley's nostrils flared and he danced sideways, refusing to face the stone building. When Gary tried to ride toward it, Harley balked, snorting and backing away so violently that Gary had to dismount. "What's gotten into you?" Gary muttered, tightening the reins. But the horse's eyes told him something else. Not fear exactly, but warning. He led Harley to the barn instead, tied him to a post, and started working the fence line. The air was unnaturally still. Even the windmill had stopped creaking. Then, 20 minutes later, the silence broke with a sound that chilled him. Frantic hooves striking wood. He ran back to find Harley thrashing, pulling hard against the rope, eyes rolling wide. The post he was tied to was shifting in the ground. Gary grabbed the lead, but the horse was too strong. Harley was trying to go somewhere, not away, but towards something. Gary followed the pull of the rope, stumbling as Harley dragged him forward, straight toward the chained stone building. The horse stopped 10 feet from the door, ears pricked, nostrils flaring again. Then he did something Gary had never seen in 30 years of working horses. He began to dig, one hoof striking the dirt again and again, methodically, as if marking a spot. Gary stood frozen. The wind stirred the grass around them, and for the first time since he arrived, he felt it. That quiet pressure, that strange unease. He tugged Harley's reins gently. "Come on, boy, enough of that." But Harley wouldn't budge. He pawed the earth once more, harder this time, then lifted his head and stared at Gary, not wild, not panicked, just certain. Gary forced the horse back to the trailer, muscles burning. As he closed the gate, Harley turned his head toward the stone building again, ears twitching, a low nicker rumbling from his throat. That night, Gary couldn't sleep. He replayed the day over and over, Claire's fear, Donovan's warning, Harley's reaction. He told himself it was nonsense, that horses just sense tension. But deep down, something cold had taken root in his gut. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in facts, and tomorrow he was going to find them. The next morning, Gary drove into the small town of Dutton, his thoughts heavy and tangled. Harley's behavior at the ranch still gnawed at him. He'd known that horse for a decade, ridden him through lightning storms and over roaring rivers. Harley wasn't the kind to scare easy. Whatever had spooked him at that old stone building wasn't just nerves, it was instinct. The road into town was lined with rusted mailboxes and wind-bent fences. Dutton was the kind of place that hadn't changed much since the 1940s. One gas station, a diner, a feed store, and a handful of shops with faded awnings. The sign at the town entrance read, "Welcome to Dutton. Population 387. Gary parked in front of Betty's Diner, a squat building with a flickering neon coffee cup in the window. He needed food, caffeine, and maybe some answers. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The smell of bacon grease and black coffee hit him like comfort. He slid into a seat at the counter. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with graying hair tied back and a name tag that read Martha, poured him coffee without asking. "Passing through?" she asked. "Thinking of settling," Gary replied. "Bought the old Barnett place out on County Road 47. Her hand froze midair. The coffee pot tilted, almost spilling. For a heartbeat, she just stared at him. Then she set the pot down slowly. "You bought what?" she whispered. "The Barnett homestead," Gary said, unsure why her tone made the hairs on his arms rise. The diner went silent. Forks stopped clinking. Conversations died mid-sentence. A young couple at the booth near the window exchanged nervous glances, and an old man in a cowboy hat muttered something under his breath before leaving his half-eaten pie and walking out. Martha's face had drained of color. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. "Nobody should live there." Gary frowned. "Why not? It's good land. Needs work, sure, but I've seen worse." She shook her head, eyes darting toward the window, as if the ranch might be watching her. "You don't know what happened there." "Then maybe you can tell me," he said. She didn't answer. Instead, she refilled his cup and walked away, her lips pressed tight. Gary ate in silence, the weight of every stolen glance pressing down on him. He paid in cash and left a generous tip, but no one said goodbye when he walked out. The little bell above the door jingled again, almost mockingly cheerful. At the gas station across the street, he found a man who was willing to talk, or at least willing to look him in the eye. The man was in his 60s, tall and weathered, with hands like cracked leather. He was filling his truck with diesel when Gary approached. "Mornin'," Gary said. "Name's Nuss. Just bought the Barnett property." The man chuckled dryly. "Then you're the fool everyone's talking about." Gary crossed his arms. "Guess that makes you the first one with the guts to tell me why." The old man turned to him, squinting beneath his hat. "Name's Pete Hoffman. Been ranching here since my daddy was alive. You really don't know the story." Gary shook his head. Pete leaned against his truck, expression unreadable. "Thomas Barnett bought that land back in the early 1900s. Good man by most accounts. Had a wife, Clara, and 3 kids, worked hard. Then one spring in 1944, he just vanished." "Vanished?" "Gone. Left for Great Falls one morning, never came back. His truck was found on the highway a few days later, keys still in the ignition. No blood, no body, just gone." Gary felt a chill slide down his spine despite the sun. "What about his wife?" "Clara?" Pete sighed. "She went mad with grief. Spent years searching the property, convinced he was still there. Died in 47. Some say her heart gave out. Others say she found something she couldn't live with." Gary frowned. "What do you mean?" Pete's eyes darkened. "No one knows. After she died, the kids boarded up the place. Never came back. Said they wanted nothing to do with it. And I don't blame them. Folks who've gone out there since, well, they say they hear things. Whispers in the fields. Footsteps at night. A figure walking the fence line at dusk." "You believe that?" Gary asked. Pete shrugged. "I believe in what I see, and I've seen enough to stay clear." Gary let out a slow breath, trying to steady his pulse. "I don't buy into ghost stories, Pete. I deal in real problems. Rusted fences, busted wells, things I can fix with my hands." Pete gave him a long look. "Maybe, but some things on that land can't be fixed with a hammer." The words stuck in Gary's mind all the way back to the homestead. When he arrived, the prairie was bathed in the orange light of evening. The wind had picked up again, rustling through the tall grass like a whisper. Harley waited in the corral, ears twitching toward the horizon. Gary stood by the truck, staring at the small stone building in the fading light. The chains glinted faintly, motionless against the door. He thought about Claire Webb refusing to leave her car, about Donovan's warning not to disturb what's sealed, about the way the entire diner went silent at the word Barnett. and about Harley, that unflappable horse, pawing the ground at that door like he was trying to speak. Gary exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooling air. "All right," he muttered. "We'll play it your way." He grabbed his toolbox from the back of the truck, bolt cutters, crowbar, flashlight, and looked toward the stone building one last time. The prairie seemed to hold its breath. Tomorrow he decided he'd find out what really lay behind that door. But tonight, even Gary couldn't deny it. The land felt alive, pulsing with something buried deep beneath its surface. Something that didn't want to stay hidden. By the time the sun cleared the horizon the next morning, Gary had already made up his mind. He wasn't a man who scared easy, and he wasn't a man who ignored good land because people in town went pale when they heard its name. He'd built his life by trusting what he could touch, fix, and control. But he also wasn't stupid. Whatever was going on out here had affected Harley, had the locals spooked, and had been locked up so hard that 3 generations refused to even set foot on their own property. That wasn't superstition. That was intent. And intent meant there was something worth knowing. The air was cold enough to sting as Gary walked across the yard towards the small stone building. Frost still clung to the dead winter grass in the shadows. Behind him, Harley stood watching from the corral, alert and silent, ears locked forward like twin antennas. "Yeah, I see it," Gary muttered. "You made your point." He carried only what he needed. Bolt cutters, a crowbar, heavy work gloves, and a flashlight. He had the deed in his truck, the keys to every gate on the property, and full legal right to everything within his fence line. But standing in front of that little stone structure, he still felt like he was trespassing. Up close, the building looked even stranger. It wasn't wood like the barn or plank like the farmhouse. It was built from thick, field-cut stone, maybe 12 feet by 12, roofed in heavy timber and corrugated metal. Solid, older than the rest, no windows, just that single wooden door. And the chains. Somebody hadn't just locked it. Somebody had tried to keep it sealed forever. 2 thick iron stakes had been driven deep into the ground on either side of the doorway. Chains had been looped around the stakes, crossed over the door, and fastened with not 1, not 2, but 3 separate padlocks the size of a man's palm. It wasn't a normal keep people out lockup. It looked like something you'd do if you were afraid of whatever was on the inside. Gary crouched down and touched one of the locks. The metal was old and pitted with rust, but still strong. 40, maybe 50 years old. Older than him. He glanced over his shoulder. The prairie was empty. The only sound was the distant creak of the windmill and Harley shifting his weight. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what's so scary." The first lock gave him fight. He wedged the jaws of the bolt cutters around the shank, braced himself, and pulled hard. His shoulders burned. The bolt cutters groaned. Then, with a dry metallic snap, the first padlock split and dropped into the dirt. The sound echoed. It shouldn't have echoed, not out here in open air, but it did. It carried across the yard like the crack of a rifle. Harley snorted sharply from the corral. Gary swallowed and moved on to the next one. The second lock came easier. The third almost felt like it wanted to go, like the metal had been waiting 40 years for someone to finally cut it loose. When he pulled the chains free, they slithered down the door and fell in a dull, heavy clatter that sent dust blooming from the threshold. For a moment, Gary just stood there, heart thudding steady and hard in his chest. He told himself it was adrenaline. Nothing more. He reached for the handle. The wood of the door was dry and smooth under his glove, worn by years of wind and sun. He turned the handle and pushed. The door resisted, then gave way with a slow, dragging groan. A bitter, old air rolled out, cool, unmoving, untouched by daylight and decades. But it wasn't rot. It wasn't decay. He'd half expected the sour stench of something dead. Instead, what came out was mechanical. Oily, metallic, like machine shops and gun bluing and something deep and earthy underneath. Gary clicked on his flashlight and stepped inside. The beam cut through the dark. The room was simple. Stone walls, dirt floor, no shelves, no tools, no bales, no canning jars, nothing you'd normally expect from a ranch outbuilding, no signs of animals ever being kept in here, no scratch marks, no droppings, nothing. No, not nothing. Something felt wrong about the floor. Gary swept the lot low. The dirt wasn't natural and lumpy like undisturbed ground. It had been tamped down smooth, like somebody had packed it tight on purpose. Then smoothed it over again. He frowned. Then he heard movement behind him. He spun fast, heart jamming into his throat. It was Harley. The horse was in the doorway. Gary had tied him in the corral. He knew he had. He'd checked the latch himself, but Harley was standing in the doorway now, huge against the morning light, his dark red coat lit from behind, breath steaming in the chill. He wasn't panicking this time. He wasn't thrashing or pulling or trying to flee. He was focused. Harley stepped forward. One hoof touched the dirt floor, then another. He walked straight past Gary into the middle of the stone room and stopped. And then, just like before, he began to dig. Not nervous pawing, not stamping, not panic. Purpose. 1 strike. 2. 3. Same spot, same rhythm, same message. Right here. Gary's mouth had gone dry. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, boy, I hear you." He crouched where Harley was marking and brushed the surface aside with his gloved hand. The top layer of dirt was loose. Beneath it, harder packed clay. Beneath that, something solid. Metal. His fingertips touched it and went cold. For a long second he didn't move. The air felt thick, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then his body took over. He grabbed the short-handled spade he'd brought and started digging. The work was brutal. The dirt was tight, layered, compacted by time. Harley stood over him the entire time, head low, ears flicking, nostrils working like he was keeping watch. Gary dug until the blade struck something with a dull, ringing thud. He cleared the rest with his hands. It wasn't a can. It wasn't a trunk. It was a box. A heavy steel box, maybe 3 feet long by 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep. The metal was oiled and wrapped in old, stained cloth. Oilcloth, the kind folks used to keep moisture out of machinery. Whoever put it there hadn't just buried it. They'd preserved it. That sent another shiver through him. If this had been trash, it wouldn't be wrapped like something important. If this had been dangerous, it wouldn't be wrapped like something precious. He hauled it up, inch by inch, grunting with the effort. The thing weighed like an engine block. By the time he dragged it out into daylight, his arms were shaking. He sat back in the dirt, breathing hard, staring at the box. "Well," he said, "you better be worth the trouble." Harley stood just behind him, calm now, watching. Gary worked at the latch. Not a lock, just a simple hasp. No keyhole, no combination. The security had been the chains on the door, the sealed building, the hidden burial. Whoever hid this hadn't expected a stranger to find it. They'd expected time to swallow it. The latch stuck, then opened. Inside, everything was layered in cloth, carefully wrapped, carefully placed. Gary peeled the first layer back. and his breath caught in his throat. Gold. Not jewelry, not trinkets, not scrap. Coins. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stacked and bundled in small leather pouches. The sunlight hit their edges, and they flashed warm and heavy, the way real gold always does. For a long, stunned second, all Gary could do was stare. "Jesus," he whispered. "What is this?" He reached in again, set the pouches aside, and unwrapped the next layer. Documents. Neatly stacked, slightly yellowed, edges crisp, not crumbling like junk left in a barn. Legal papers, typed contracts, bank statements, property records, signatures in lupin black ink, and beneath that, one more object, flat and dark. A book, leather-bound, worn, but not ruined, preserved. There was a name burned into the cover in faded gold lettering, Thomas Barnett, 1944. Gary felt a pulse of something he didn't want to name. He picked up the journal and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was careful, tight, clean. No shaking, no rushing. Every letter looked like it had been written by a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and exactly what it would cost him. The first line wasn't a greeting. It was a confession. "I'm writing this because if something happens to me, someone needs to know the truth. My name is Thomas Barnett, and I've been a coward for 22 years. Gary swallowed. He kept reading. In 1922, I did something that has eaten me alive every day since. I told myself I was doing it to protect Clara. I told myself I was doing it to build a life for our family. That was a lie. I did it because I was weak. This is my account of what happened and where the money came from. If you're reading this, it means I'm either dead or gone. Either way, I deserve it." Gary closed the journal for a moment and pressed his thumb against the leather cover. Thomas Barnett. The name everyone in Dutton still whispered like it belonged to a ghost. The man who had vanished. Gary stared out across the prairie. All at once, the silence around him felt different. Not haunted. Heavy. He looked back down at the box, the gold, the papers, the journal dated 1944, and felt something settle in him, a kind of understanding. The Barnett homestead wasn't just land. It wasn't just abandoned buildings and half-fallen fences. It was a sealed story, a story nobody had let end. Gary knew right then, sitting in the dirt beside the open box, with Harley breathing warm air over his shoulder, that whatever he'd found in that journal was going to explain everything. The panic in town, the chains, the heirs who wanted no contact, the lawyer who wouldn't look him in the eye. The way Harley, a horse with more sense than most men, had dragged him to this exact spot. This wasn't about superstition. This was about truth. Truth that someone had buried and had meant to keep buried. Gary turned back to the first page of the journal. He took a breath and began to read. The journal's pages felt fragile under Gary's hands, like they might crumble if he breathed too hard. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were clear, carved by a man desperate to be heard. He turned to the next entry and began to read. March 3rd, 1944. I have lived 22 years with this burden, and I cannot carry it any longer. The land, the home, everything Clara and I built, it all came from sin. Gary exhaled, the words already heavy. The wind outside sighed through the cracks of the barnwood, and Harley shifted behind him, quiet but alert as if listening too. It began in 1922. I was working as a clerk at the Great Falls Bank. My supervisor, Mr. Edward Carrillo, was a charming man, respected, trusted, admired. One day during the audit, I discovered a series of forged transactions. Money had been siphoned away, small amounts at first, then larger. when I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He said he'd been doing it for years and that the money was sitting in a secret account, nearly $200,000, a fortune. He offered me half to stay quiet. I told myself it was wrong, but I also told myself it was a chance for Clara and me to have something of our own, to escape poverty. I said yes. Gary's stomach turned. The neat handwriting was steady, but every line carried guilt that bled through the paper. We hid the theft. Carril forged the records and framed a dead accountant to cover the tracks. I took my share in cash and converted it slowly to gold, keeping it quiet. We moved to Dutton. I bought this land and told Clara it was a lucky inheritance. I thought I could build a new life and bury my shame beneath the soil. The next page trembled slightly under Gary's fingers. The handwriting had grown smaller, more frantic. But sin doesn't stay buried. Each year it grew heavier. I could not sleep. I saw his face, the accountant who was blamed, every time I closed my eyes. I told Clara I was fine, that the nightmares were from the war, but she knew. She always knew something was wrong. By 1943, I could no longer stand it. I heard the bank had failed, that Carril was in California, a rich man. He wrote me once, just once, after 10 years. Said he was thinking of visiting Montana again. I burned the letter, but I can still feel the smoke in my lungs. Gary paused. The shadows outside had lengthened. The sun was slipping toward the horizon. The prairie had that soft orange glow that made everything look older, timeless. He turned another page. March 25th, 1944. I've decided to tell the truth. Tomorrow I will go to Great Falls and turn myself in. I will confess everything, the theft, the fraud, my part in it. I will leave the gold and the documents here, locked away in the stone building where they can't be used for evil again. Clara will not understand. The children will hate me. But maybe one day they'll forgive me when they learn I tried to make things right. I have sealed this place with every lock I own. When I leave in the morning, it will stay sealed forever. No one must open it unless I do not return. The entry ended abruptly. No signature, just a smudge of ink like a pen dragged across the paper by a shaking hand. Gary closed the journal slowly. He stared at the final words, trying to picture the man who had written them. The weight on his shoulders, the fear, the impossible hope that confession would bring peace. But Thomas Barnett never made it to Great Falls. Gary drove to the city the next day, the journal on the passenger seat beside him. He spent hours at the public library combing through microfilm of old newspapers, his eyes aching from the flickering light. And there it was. Page 3 of the Great Falls Tribune, April 12, 1944. Local rancher missing. Authorities search for Dutton. Man, Thomas Barnett, 44 of Dutton, Montana, has been missing since March 28th. His truck was discovered on Highway 87, abandoned, keys still in the ignition. His wife, Clara, reported him missing when he failed to return from a trip to Great Falls. Authorities found no signs of foul play. There were follow-up stories, search parties, reward offers, all leading nowhere. The case went cold. Gary requested the police file. Weeks later, a thin envelope arrived in the mail. Inside were photocopied notes from the original investigation. One paragraph stood out. Vehicle located 12 miles south of Great Falls. Truck in working condition. Keys in ignition. Tire tracks indicate another vehicle stopped alongside. Second set of footprints, larger than victims, visible near driver's side. No evidence of struggle. Believed victim may have been picked up voluntarily. Gary's pulse quickened. The handwriting in the report matched a note in the journal. He said he might visit Montana again. Careel. Gary checked the archives again. He found Careel's obituary from 1967. Edward M. Careel, 76, prominent businessman, passed away in Sacramento, California. Known for his ventures in the automobile industry and for frequent trips to Montana during the 1940s. That was enough. Gary didn't need proof beyond that. The pieces fit. Thomas Barnett had planned to confess. Careel found out and couldn't risk exposure. He'd followed Thomas, intercepted him on that lonely highway, and made sure the truth never reached the authorities. Gary stared at the photocopied reports until the letters blurred. The ghost that haunted the Barnett homestead wasn't a spirit, it was guilt. Guilt that had soaked into the soil, into the wood, into the memory of the place. That night, Gary sat on the farmhouse porch with the journal open in his lap. The air was calm, the stars sharp against the dark. Harley grazed nearby, occasionally lifting his head as if listening to something only he could hear. Gary spoke softly into the night. "Who stopped you, Thomas? You were trying to do the right thing, weren't you?" A breath of wind stirred through the grass, whispering against the fence posts. Gary thought about the gold, the fortune that could change his life if he wanted it to. No one would ever know. The law couldn't touch him. The crime had long expired. But the words from the journal echoed in his head. "I have decided to tell the truth." If Thomas Barnett had died trying to set things right, then Gary owed it to him to finish what he started. He placed the journal back into the box, alongside the gold and the documents. Tomorrow he would call a lawyer. Tomorrow he would call the authorities. Harley snorted softly from the field, his silhouette dark against the starlight. "Yeah, boy," Gary said quietly. "I think he's finally ready to rest." Gary had handled horses his entire life. He knew how to pull a foal in a storm, how to calm a panicked gelding in a lightning strike, how to stitch a cut with the shaky rancher hands when the nearest vet was 60 miles out. But nothing in his life had prepared him for walking into the county offices with a metal box full of gold, a stack of 70-year-old financial records, and the written confession of a missing man. He didn't sleep the night before. The journal sat on his kitchen table. The box sat on the floor by his boots. Harley slept in the paddock behind the barn, but even he didn't settle like normal. Every time Gary looked out the back window, the horse was awake, head up, watching the old stone building, as if guarding what it had given them. In the morning, Gary loaded the box into the truck himself, heart hammering the whole time. It felt wrong to move it, like he was taking bones out of a grave, but that was the point, wasn't it? Thomas Barnett had been buried without a body, without a truth, without a name on anything but rumor. The least Gary could do was dig him up and give him back. He drove to Great Falls. He met with a lawyer first. The lawyer, a sharp woman with straight posture and a voice like steel, barely blinked at the gold. But when Gary slid Thomas Barnett's journal across the desk and said, "He wrote this in 1944, the week he disappeared," her expression finally cracked. They read. Together. They read about the theft in 1922, about the bank manager, Edward Careel, about the forged ledgers, about the stolen money converted to gold, about guilt like a sickness eating a man alive, about the final entry, "I will confess in the morning," and the drive Thomas never came back from. And then, quietly, they read the last 2 lines again. "If I vanish, it will be because Careel could not let me speak. I'm not running. I'm going to tell the truth." The lawyer drew in a long, careful breath, then said, "We're not sitting on this." They contacted the Montana Attorney General's office. They turned over everything: the journal, the gold, the documents, copies of the 1944 police notes that proved Thomas Barnett's truck had been found abandoned with the keys still inside and tracks from a second vehicle alongside it. They didn't bring in a ghost story. They brought in evidence. Gary expected to be treated like a crank rancher with too much time and a dramatic imagination. Instead, phones started ringing. The story moved fast, faster than Gary liked. By the end of the week, people in suits were driving up his dirt road and knocking on his warped farmhouse door. Reporters wanted to stand in front of the stone outbuilding and get camera shots of the room that held the secret. Photographers wanted pictures of the gold, the ledger pages, the oilcloth-wrapped box. And everyone wanted Harley. "Is it true the horse found it?" they kept asking. Gary didn't like reporters. Most of them talked like they already knew the ending and just needed him to fill in the middle. But one headline, he'd admit it, made him smile in spite of himself: "Horse solves 43-year-old mystery." It ran in the Great Falls Tribune first, then in Helena, then in the Billings Gazette, then in the New York Times. After that, it wasn't just a local curiosity, it was a story. A Montana rancher and his horse had uncovered the truth about a man who had disappeared in 1944. A man who had not run away from his family, not fled in shame, not abandoned anyone, but had tried to walk into town and confess a crime he'd carried like a chain around his own throat. It wasn't supernatural. It was human. That made it worse. The Attorney General's office reopened the case surrounding Thomas Barnett's disappearance. The FBI got involved, formally this time, not because they thought they'd get a conviction. Both main players were dead, and the primary suspect, Edward Carrillo, had died in California in 1967 with money, reputation, and clean hands, but because of what the case represented. It wasn't just a missing person anymore. It was silenced accountability. Gary didn't have language for any of that. He wasn't a lawyer or a politician. He was a man who hauled hay and patched fences. But he understood one thing very clearly. Thomas Barnett had tried to do the right thing and never got the chance. And he, Gary Noss, had been put in a position to finish that job. That meant responsibility. That meant no line about how he found the box. So when the state investigator asked him, in a tone halfway between professional and skeptical, "Mr. Noss, what made you open that building in the first place?" Gary answered plainly. "My horse told me," he said. The investigator just stared. Gary didn't blink. "Harley wouldn't settle, wouldn't eat, dragged me to that stone shed, scraped the dirt until his hoof hit metal. I did the digging, but he's the one who found it." He waited for the smirk. It never came. Later, he would learn why. The man went home and told his wife the story. His wife told her sister. Her sister told a co-worker. By the time it circled back into the public, it wasn't Gary Noss, area rancher, discovered a buried confession. It was a horse uncovered the truth a man died trying to tell. That version spread faster. People liked that one better. The legal side of things got complicated with the gold. It wasn't just a box of coins. It was stolen bank money tied to fraud more than 4 decades old. The original bank didn't exist anymore. Most of the depositors were long dead. The statute of limitations had run out on prosecuting the theft. The man who'd orchestrated the embezzlement, Carrillo, had lived wealthy and died comfortable. So who, legally, did it belong to? There were memos, there were calls, there were meetings Gary wasn't invited to. In the end, a judge made the call. The money would not go to the state. It would not go to the Barnett heirs. It would not go to Gary. Instead, it would be turned into something living, a fund. A victims' compensation fund for people in Montana who'd been harmed by bank fraud. People whose savings had been stolen, whose accounts had been tampered with, whose trust had been ripped out from under them by the same kind of quiet, polished theft that had started this whole mess in 1922. And it wouldn't just be a faceless pool of cash, it would carry a name. The Barnett Fund, they called it. Gary sat in the back of that courthouse room and felt something twist in his throat when he heard it said out loud. Not haunted land, not cursed homestead, not ghost story, a fund with a name. Thomas Barnett's name. A name connected not to shame, but to making it right. He wondered, briefly, what Clara would have thought. Whether it would have helped. Whether it could have eased the way she sat up at night in that farmhouse, waiting for footsteps that never came, calling into the dark for a husband she believed might still answer. The Barnett children were brought in quietly. No cameras for that. There were 3 of them, all grown now, gray-haired in their 60s and 70s. They came to meet Gary at the old farmhouse one afternoon, long after the news trucks had rolled out and the state men had stopped circling. They sat at the scarred wooden kitchen table while Gary slid the journal forward. "This is your father's," he said. They didn't touch it at first. The oldest, Robert, finally reached out. His hand shook when he opened the cover. They read in silence for a long time. Gary stayed standing. It felt wrong to sit. He watched as guilt hit, then anger, then grief. Not the grief of losing someone. They'd done that already in 1944. This was the grief of learning what that loss actually was. When they finished, Robert closed the journal and pressed both hands flat on top of it, like he needed to hold it to the table to keep from floating away. "All these years," he said, voice breaking, "we thought he ran. We thought he didn't love us enough to come back. We thought he chose to leave." He swallowed hard. He wasn't running. He was trying to fix it. He was trying to fix it, and somebody stopped him. Gary didn't say, "I'm sorry. It wasn't the right thing. Sorry didn't live here. Truth did." "I'm not keeping the property," Robert said after a long silence. "None of us want it. Too many memories, and none of them good. But I don't want it torn down either. I don't want it flipped and sold to some developer and turned into a billboard for a sad story." He looked up at Gary. "If you're really doing something with horses like you said, if you're really going to help something heal, then do it here. Make this place mean something." Gary nodded once. "I will." And he did. He poured everything into it. He patched the fences, replaced the gate, cleared the pastures. He reinforced the old red barn and converted the stalls. He put in quarantine pens for animals that came in underweight or shaking from abuse. He ran water out to the back lot. He called vets who owed him favors and asked them to come out and work at cost. He named it Second Chances Ranch, for the horses who had been starved, beaten, thrown away, and for one man who had tried at the end to do the right thing. The farmhouse didn't stay a house. Gary didn't move into it. Instead, he cleaned it out, repainted the front room, and turned it into something like a living museum. Not for tourists with cameras who wanted to whisper and say, "This is where the ghost walked." He hated that language. No, it was for kids. School groups started to come out on field trips. He'd bring them into the front room and show them copies of the old articles from 1944. Local rancher missing. He'd show them Thomas Barnett's handwriting from the journal, blown up and framed behind glass. He'd talk, not like a preacher, not like a lecture, but like a man who had dragged truth out of the dirt with his own hands. He told them about right and wrong, about consequence, about how doing the wrong thing will own you, even if nobody ever catches you, about what courage looks like when it shows up late. Some days he'd bring Harley in at the end and let the kids feed him slices of apple. You'd never seen children so reverent as when they're standing next to a horse that solved the mystery. They'd stroke Harley's neck like they were touching a living legend. Harley didn't mind the attention. He soaked it in like sunlight. Gary never sold him. Offers came, big ones. Men with soft hands and big checks wanted to retire the famous horse, stable him somewhere clean, show him off like a trophy at barbecues. Gary said no every single time. "He's not for sale," he'd answer, and that was that. Because Harley wasn't an attraction. He was part of it. He was the one who wouldn't let the truth stay buried. The stone building stayed too. Gary never rebuilt the door. He refused to chain it up again. Instead, he swept the floor, scrubbed the walls, set the empty steel box in the center on a low stand, and mounted a small plaque on the back wall. It said, "In memory of Thomas Barnett, 1900-1944. He tried to make things right. May we all have such courage that was the only place on the property where Gary let it get quiet. He didn't talk there. He didn't explain. He let the room explain itself." Years passed. The Barnett homestead stopped being that haunted place. It stopped being a dare teenagers used on each other to prove who'd sneak up there at night. It became a rescue ranch. A place where ruined horses came in shaken and left with their heads high. A place teachers called when they needed to teach about honesty in a way a textbook never could. And in the evenings, when the sun hung low and the light turned the prairie gold, Gary would sometimes walk the fence line with a hammer in his hand and a pocket of nails, looking for weak posts the winter had pushed loose. One evening, 3 years after he found the box, he was out past the stone building, mending a corner section the snowpack had warped. Harley grazed nearby, lazy and content. The air was that kind of calm that only happens right before full dark, when the land feels like it's holding still. He felt it first. He didn't hear footsteps. He didn't hear breathing. He just felt the air change, like someone else was standing with him in the same piece of quiet. He looked up. There, about 50 yards away along the fence line, a man stood watching him. Not close enough to touch. Not close enough to speak. Just there. Gary's first thought wasn't fear, it was recognition. The man looked like every photograph he'd seen of farmers in the 1930s and 40s. Work shirt, suspenders, brimmed hat. Solid, weathered, not young, not old. His posture wasn't angry or restless or searching. It was relieved, grateful. "Thank you," that posture said, without saying anything at all. Gary didn't move for a long time. He just stood there with the hammer in his hand, heart pounding slow and deep in his ribs. He blinked against the lowering light, and for a split second the figure blurred in the shimmer of heat coming off the land. And then he was gone, vanished like dust. Gary never told reporters that part. He almost never told anyone that part. When people asked him years later, "Do you believe this place was haunted?" he always answered the same way. "It wasn't haunted," he'd say. "It was waiting." Because that's what it had felt like from the start. Not cursed, waiting. Waiting for someone stubborn enough to cut chains no one else would touch. Waiting for someone decent enough to give the truth to the light instead of the black market. Waiting for a horse who knew where to dig. Harley lived to be 28. For a working quarter horse, that's a long, honest life. In his last years, he didn't carry riders anymore. He didn't need to. His job had changed. Now he was the calm presence in the pasture that scared horses learned to stand beside. The proof that trust was still possible. When he died in 2005, Gary buried him on the property, not far from the stone building where he'd pawed that first message into the dirt. He marked the spot with a simple headstone. Harley, 1977, 2005. He found what was lost. People cried when they saw it. Grown men, school teachers, kids who'd outgrown field trips but still drove out on weekends just to lean on the fence and breathe in that quiet, open air. Second chances. Ranch kept going. It's still going. 30-plus years after Gary signed the deed for $300 and everybody in town called him a fool, the ranch has taken in thousands of abused, neglected, and abandoned horses, given them food and medicine and patience and safety until they could be placed in new homes or live out their lives in peace. It carries two legacies now. One belongs to Harley, the horse that wouldn't be ignored. The other belongs to a man the world thought ran away. And when visitors ask about that land, about the rumors, about the curse, Gary always tells them the same thing. It was never ghosts, he says. It was a secret. It was guilt. It was a truth that couldn't rest. All it needed was somebody willing to dig it up and do the right thing with it. He doesn't add the last part out loud, but he thinks it every time. And sometimes somebody isn't a person. Sometimes it's a horse. Because the Barnett Homestead taught him something he hadn't known at 47 years old, but understood clear as daylight by 60. What people call a curse is often just an unfinished story. Redemption doesn't always happen when you're alive. And the truth, no matter how long you bury it, will push its way back to the surface. Through guilt, through time, through fear, through silence. Until somebody finally listens. Gary listened. Harley listened first. And Thomas Barnett, at last, got to rest with his name cleared, his story told, and his land turned into a sanctuary instead of a warning. The prairie is quiet at dusk now. Not empty, just calm. Horses graze. Wind moves through the grass. Fence wire hums softly. And if you stand by that old stone building in the fading light, some people say you can still see a man walking the fence line, shoulders loose, head lifted, like a weight finally slid off his back. They don't describe him as angry. They don't describe him as lost. They describe him as peaceful, content, home. Sometimes the past doesn't rest. It waits for someone brave enough to uncover it. Gary and his horse Harley didn't just find gold, they found redemption. If this story moved you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that truth always finds its way to the surface. Tell us in the comments, do you believe animals can sense things we can't?